Hello everyone, welcome to another list video, and in this one I'm going to talk about my honorable mentions of 2018. These are the albums that didn't manage to make it into my list of my top 50 favorite albums of 2018, which I'm going to talk in the future, but I still think there are some good albums that I would like to recommend, and it would be a shame if I wouldn't at least mention them. So these are 20 albums that go from a 6 plus to a 7 minus, and so let's just go. Number 20, Wishville by Ocean Wisdom, an album that came early this year from one of the most talented UK rappers I've ever heard. His delivery on tracks like Eye Contact is just godlike. His flow is just one of the most insane I've ever heard. But the issue compared to Chaos 93 is some really uninteresting and forgettable beats, and most of the hooks are kind of weak. While I do like this album, and I definitely recommend you to check out for a hip-hop release that goes more to the old school style of the 90s, it definitely is not that great as Chaos 93, which I highly recommend you to check out if you haven't already. A4Eyes also came out early in 2018, and I would say this is one of the best things Cupcake has ever done. Not only some of her flows and some of her rapping is incredible, she got her hands into some better production this time. However, there are still moments where she goes to this kind of pop and sort of reggaeton direction that I'm not a big fan of. This is once again an extremely inconsistent and messy album, but some of her best tracks land on this album. So yeah, it's a highly recommended hip-hop release for me. This is the first album by the RCA label, made by hip-hop group and the biggest boy band since One Direction, Brockhampton. Even with Amir's absence from the group, they still make such a fantastic job as a collective. There's an amazing chemistry and connection between the artists, but most of the time my issue with their albums comes with some extremely forgettable songs, and I would say this is one of their best projects, but still, once again, there are some really amazing tracks and others that just flew by, kind of forgettable, but I still recommend for fans of Brockhampton to check this one out if for some weird reason they haven't already. Time and Place is a huge change of direction from Kero Kero Bonito, who started as a cutesy synth-pop trio, and then they turned into twee-pop and noise and garage rock. They teased this new sound with their Tote EP that came out this year as well, which is one of my favorite EPs of the year. However, this new full-length album kind of disappointed me. I think they do a great job to deliver in another genre of music that we're not used to from them, but I couldn't really connect with this one and find lots of moments that they will make me come back to the album as a full experience, but it's still a pretty decent release. I have to mention the mini albums Antipositive Part 1 and 2 by Little Big. Russian Rave and Dance Group released one of my favorite albums of 2015, Funeral Rave, and I was really hyped for anything they would do in the future. What I can say is that these are some of the most serious stuff they've ever done. They've definitely matured as a group, and they have by far their best production out of any other release. However, some of the extremely straightforward and absurd sounds that made Little Big so special in the first place, in my opinion, are not really that present, but there are still some good moments. I love Faradenza and Skibidi, which are the two biggest singles out of both albums, but other than that, despite their short length, the rest of the tracks were mostly okay, and I definitely recommend you to check out at least the main singles, Faradenza and Skibidi, which have some great and fun music videos as well. Mad Boy is probably one of the weirdest trap albums I've heard all year. This is due to the ridiculous amount of ad-libs, some really weird deliveries, and some really interesting and eerie production at some points. Now, as a whole project, I don't think it's that consistent or it's that amazing. However, I've played tracks like Live Sequest, Die Sequest, and Mobaba non-stop. They are two of my biggest bangers of the year, and there are some other tracks like Mindfucker, Gmail, and Chippy Chippy that keep the album strong as well. Interesting trap release, go check this out if you haven't already. This is a really interesting hardcore punk and noise rock album combined with some Halloween themed samples, and it has a really creepy and eerie atmosphere throughout of it. It didn't blow me away, but I think it's an interesting and underrated release from 2018 that you need to check out. Veteran by JPEG Mafia is one of the albums that blew up this year. One of the glitchiest and most experimental hip-hop albums of 2018. It's actually not in my top 50 list, because even though I love songs like Real Nega and Baby I'm Bleeding, taking this as a whole thing, there were a lot of tracks, especially on the second half, that didn't really impress me. However, I can still appreciate that the production on this thing is amazing. JPEG Mafia has an intense delivery, some great flows and rapping throughout this whole thing. It just didn't manage to be in a higher place for me, though I definitely appreciate it for what it is. Firepower by Judas Priest is one of the biggest comeback heavy metal albums, period. Judas Priest came out with some of their best works after a very long time. The riffs on this thing, the whole performance is mind-blowing of how good it is, and Rob Halford's vocals sound better than ever. It has kind of a standard formula for a Judas Priest album. However, in this one, I think that they managed to give us this good old 80s heavy metal sound that we all love and we all appreciate it. I'm pretty happy with this one. Pianist Luke Howard made a modern classical and contemporary album that it was interesting. It kinda gets one-dimensional after a point. However, I think that some of his compositions are extremely interesting, and it's probably one of my favorite classical releases I've heard all year. If you want some chill piano music, go check this one out. It's an interesting release. This is the sequel from one of my favorite noise albums out of 2016, so I was really hyped for this one. I first discovered Askew from a split they did with Merzbow, which was a really interesting noise sound with some ambient and jazz passages throughout of it, and Volume 1 was just mind-blowing. An extremely good release with some really interesting production and textures. Now, Volume 2 is kind of the same thing, however, most of the ideas presented on this one not even close to Volume 1. There are still some good ideas here and there, but yeah, it's a little bit of a disappointment considering how much I liked Volume 1, but I still think it's one of those underground noise releases that I highly recommend. I would say this is one of the best releases Other Tongues has released in a very long time. I was kind of underwhelmed with some of the newer material. However, the mix of industrial noise music and black metal in this one in particular is extremely solid, and even though the second half kinda drags down into some one-dimensional themes, the first tracks on this thing are extremely disturbing and hard-patching. So yeah, if you're like heavily distorted sounds with black metal and industrial noise elements, give this one a shot. Sir by Fisher Spooner is one of the gayest albums ever made, and I'm pretty sure this was the intention. I didn't just say this out of my head. I will say this is the best album they've done since their debut. Yeah, and that says a lot. It has some of the most interesting and well-crafted electroclash and electropop sounds out of every release of this year. Definitely go and check this one out. The reason this one is so high is because of 44 More. It's one of my favorite songs of the year. I love the instrumental on this, I love the lyrics, I love the bars, I love his speedy flow, and I would say in this particular mixtape, Logic delivers some of his best flows, and most of the time the production on this thing is really solid. The one song that drags this down a little bit actually is Everyday with Marshmello, which was the only track I didn't really care for. But the rest of this is mostly fire. One of my favorite trap releases of this year. Your Queen is a Reptile is one of the most talked and highly praised jazz albums that were released this year, and I can definitely see why. And even though it's kind of simplistic, it's not your weird free improvised jazz album, it's still really effective for what it does. The one thing that I was not really a big fan of are some of the rapping and vocal snippets, but other than that, the rest of the album instrumentally is absolutely gorgeous. This one took me by surprise. I saw a lot of people talk about it and praise this album, and I was like, let's give it a shot. But this was a really interesting Latin pop album with some great instrumentation behind it. The tracks I wasn't really a huge fan of were actually the singles out of this album, because they were going more into a generic Latin pop and reggaeton direction. But if you count those out, the rest of the album is one of the most intriguing Latin pop releases currently, in my opinion. Doom by Scarlord is one of the most hard-hitting and aggressive and banging trap albums of 2018. It's kind of one-dimensional, but I prefer this sort of sound rather than some of his previous stuff, which had a bit of auto-tune and out-of-place moments. This one is just banger after banger after banger, and I think some of the best releases from Scarlord land on this album over here. I wanted to like this album more, but I just couldn't. It doesn't really manage to stand out for some of their previous releases, like Insides, and then the All Together, and then the Blue Album, and then Wonky, and now this is the one time where I think after a huge comeback they didn't manage to come with an album that would be in my top 10 list or even in my top 50. Yeah, it's probably one of my least favorite Orbital releases, but still, they're Orbital, they just don't have a bad release. But you know, I'm still kind of underwhelmed with this one. That was an album I was pleasantly surprised with. I heard it very late this year, even though I was aware of it before, and this is one of the most intriguing and most unique noise rock and hardcore punk albums I've heard all year. It definitely goes over City Hunter, it definitely goes over Idols, it definitely goes over Daughters. I would say that this is the one album out of all this that you really need to check out if you haven't already. And so the one album that was the closest for being in my top 50 list but wasn't is this new comeback album from Karen 93. I would say is one of the best works she has done for years probably, and even though I really love its varied instrumentation and once again David Tippett's poetry style and voice, this is an extremely well produced folk release with an extremely rich instrumentation. However, I didn't see myself coming that often back to it, even though I really appreciate it for what it is. And also there is another album that Karen 93 released this year, and I saw no one talk about it, and I'm not talking about the collab with Zoo, and this one is actually in my top 50 list, so look forward to that. But with that being said, that was the list with my 20 honorable mentions of 2018. Do you agree or disagree with this? What were your honorable mentions of the year? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.